Governance, which has been suspended in embattled Iraq for the past 6 months, is poised to be revived with last week's appointment of the intelligence chief Mustafa al-Kadhimi as the new prime minister. In the international perspective, an outcry is improbable quite yet, as Kadhimi is said to be neutral so far with respect to regional and international players of politics. As the head of the new government, Prime Minister Kadhimi will begin his term without a full cabinet after several ministerial candidates were rejected by the political class. He will therefore have to tolerate quarrels at day one of his appointment, which was announced after months of protests and jockeying of power. It becomes imperative for Kadhimi's government to deal with an impending economic crisis precipitated by the coronavirus pandemic, which has led to a drastic fall in the price of oil, Iraq's principal source of revenue. Kadhimi's government will also have to confront terrorism spearheaded by ISIS as the extremist group steps up attacks on government troops from hideouts in remote areas of northern Iraq. For the meantime, Kadhimi benefits from strong ties with all of Iraq's constituencies and power centers, as well as the goodwill of Washington, Tehran, Riyadh, and all key regional capitals. Even the Iraqi protesters seem to be giving him space for now to implement his program. However, despite the hopeful signs around Kadhimi's transition, Iraq's economic crisis is dire, its political institutions fragile, and its security situation perilous. The risk of state collapse remains real, especially as the United States is trying to facilitate Iraq's engagement with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other international organizations, also known as cooking up a new recipe for disaster. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Iraq's parliament has approved a new government after 6 months without one, as parties bickered until the last minute over cabinet seats in backroom deals. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, Iraq's intelligence chief and a former journalist, will head the government but will begin his term without a full cohort of ministers after several candidates were rejected. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Mohammed Abaid, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Abaid. Now, to begin with what the mainstream media spoke about Mr. Kadhimi here, the New York Times itself, in the first sentence it spoke about the new government in Iraq, they chose these following words. Iraq's parliament chose an American-backed former intelligence chief as the new prime minister. How do you assess this imperial tone with the mainstream media, and what do you think it holds within with concern to the comprehension of the Iraqi political situation right now?
Well, Marwa, there is a lot of acclaim in this headline. Of course, when you say something about this in this tone, this means either you are really a colonial power, either you are really in control, which is not really the case with the Americans. And I can just quote, due to the shortage of time, quote 2 examples in this regard. I mean, you have American officials, whenever they come to Iraq, they do not declare if they are coming, whether they are defense secretary or the state secretary. And you have also a parliament that called for the withdrawal of the American forces, occupation forces from Iraq. So you are not talking about a country that is being controlled by the United States. Of course, the claim is trying to cover these facts that the Americans are not really in control. They have the say through some people who are being backed by the United States and who back the U.S. policies, and they are quite few, not that much in the political arena in Iraq. But for this claim to be really true, we would not see, as you said earlier, I think, in the communications made by the new Prime Minister, Mr. Kadhimi, who received the visits from through the U.S. ambassador, but also from the Iranian ambassador in Iraq, in Baghdad. And also today in the morning, he received a phone call from the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. So you are talking about a figure personality, I mean Kadhimi, who maybe, I'm not underlining anything or confirming, who may be the intersection of some political interests of both parties by the US and the Islamic Republic of Iran, or also some may argue that a time has come for this a certain lull in the tension that has been on the rise since the beginning of 2020, and basically by the assassination of martyr al-Kadhimi by the American occupation forces. So you have the whole image, and if the press tries to claim that it is a decision made by the only and one controlling force in Iraq, which is the United States, this is utterly not true.
This is exactly the case, which is why I want to talk about why a number of the members of his cabinet were refused by the political blocs. This gives way of how the Iraqi political scene works. You have to approve of someone in order for that someone to take that position. And namely, this happened over the same portfolios by the two former premiers, which were Adel Abdul Mahdi and another one who came just before Kadhimi as well. He just was not able to form a cabinet because of the refusal of the political elite in Iraq. But given this refusal of Kadhimi's agriculture, trade and justice choices, how do you think that his government is supposed to face such harsh challenges like that of the COVID-19 and the drastic economic crisis in Iraq?
Well, not only this, he is facing also the issues of the corruption in the country. He's facing also the tensions, which we are regional tensions we're talking about, the Turkish-Kurdish tensions, which rise and ebb and flow from time to time. You have also the relations with the other neighbors of Iraq, such as Saudi Arabia, which also has been infiltrating into many ways, which brings us also to the issue of ISIS, which popped up also a short while ago. So he's not in a position to be envied by anyone, but still, if there is some cooperation from the parties, which is also another thing that is quite dear and difficult in Iraq, due to the many divisions by the political parties, by the also ethnic and religious and confessional divisions between the ethnic groups in Iraq. So he's coming to hold a real ball of fire, but let's hope that with some cooperation and some realistic approach by the political parties in Iraq in order to make him succeed. And this, what part of it, we have seen it at the regional level.
Well, there's another a big fireball, just like you just mentioned right now, also in the hands of Kadhimi, which was very interesting to me to hear him say it when he said that there's a necessity to bring all armed groups and the militias, this is his words, not mine, under control of the Prime Minister as the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces in Iraq and, quote, prevent Iraq from being a battleground between regional and international forces. How do you think this will work mainly within the forces that were the only viable forces against ISIS in Iraq? And I'm talking here about the Hashd al-Shabi.
Well, it is my belief that we will be hearing a lot of similar statements by Mr. Kadhimi. You have here within the statement some two demands by the main powers that are, let's say, have influence in Iraq. As for the Hashd al-Shabi, this is a demand by the US, because anything that they see against really the real party that fought ISIS was the Hashd al-Shabi. So, and the Americans were moving this puppet militia in order to serve their interests. So the Americans want to stop or to curb the power of the Hashd al-Shabi, and this part of the statement served the American demand in this regard. The other part...
But the Hashd al-Shabi is actually part of the Iraqi armed forces, yes, as per a bill passed by the parliament.
Yes, officially you are saying this is right. And also officially he is under the the chief of staff basically is the commander of the armed forces is the prime minister. So you are not, he's not saying something that is new, but as I was telling you, it is something to say that I'm really walking in the line between the two main powers, which I was continuing, the United States on the one hand, and the issue of the Iraq being used as a battleground against any neighboring country also serves the Iran and aims to reassure Iran that he, as a prime minister, will not be allowing any aggression against Iran from Iraq.
Well, there's another maybe crisis that's facing Kadhimi's government, which is also the economic crisis that has been affected very much also by the coronavirus global pandemic here. And it has touched on Iraq's oil prices, which is the principal source of revenue for the Iraqis and for the Iraq as a government. But this makes it likely that Kadhimi will have to either cut the salaries of the government employees or even maybe cut jobs. And this is a scary part. How do you think that the people who have been benefiting from these jobs, who are part of Iraq's political blocs, will react to losing their salaries, losing their jobs?
No, I think what reports has been stating is that he will resort to issues of borrowing money in order to help in this regard as for the salaries and so. But I think the problem is somewhere else. I mean, the problem as we have here in Lebanon, the issue of corruption is quite horrible. No matter how much revenues, how much money you get into the country, it is being squandered into corruption and corrupted people.
That's exactly the point of getting a loan, Mr. Abed, which means that you have to decrease the cost-effective maybe measures inside of your country, like cutting jobs, in order to get a loan, for example, from the IMF. How do you think that Iraqis will actually maybe take that? Would they accept it? Would they refuse it? How would they react to that?
Yes, and also take into account also the demonstrations did not stop.
Definitely.
They are still there. So yes, you are talking about something that we will be witnessing some opposition from parties on the ground, also in the parliament and so. But here you have to deal with the lesser evil. I mean, you have two catastrophic results, and you have to choose the one that is less harmful to your country, to your people, and so. So as once again, I can repeat this, that he is not in a situation enviable by anyone.
I want to thank you very much, Mohammed Abed, a political commentator, for joining us to talk about the new Prime Minister in Iraq. Thank you for your contribution, and please stay tuned for our next segment about Syria. The Syrian Arab Army and their allies from the National Defense Forces squared off with ISIS terrorists in the Al-Mayadeen district of Deir, resulting in a fierce battle for a couple of hours. At the same time, the Syrian Army addressed an ISIS attack in the Badiya Al-Sukhnah area of Homs, which resulted in a short clash with the terrorists. ISIS hit Syria again in this following report. After major military setbacks 2 years ago, ISIS is showing signs it is regrouping in parts of Iraq and Syria, stoking fears of a dreaded resurgence of the terror group in the war-weary countries. But some experts said the group's lethal capacity remained far lower than in previous years, and it has yet to show major tactical changes. On May 7, ISIS attacked Syrian Army military vehicles in the Syrian desert, killing at least 11 soldiers. The attack adds to numerous assaults in the vast desert region west of the Euphrates, including in Deir, Homs, and Suwaida, which have martyred an estimated 515 Syrian Army soldiers and National Defense Forces since March 2019. In next-door Iraq, there have also been greater signs of aggressive designs from ISIS as the country's fragile government focuses its efforts on fighting the coronavirus pandemic. On May 2, ISIS fighters killed 10 members of the Popular Mobilization Forces in fierce clashes in Salahuddin province, one of the most fatal encounters in the country in at least 2 years. The Popular Mobilization Forces released a statement confirming that 10 of its fighters were martyred by the terror group near the city of Balad and said that it had killed numerous ISIS fighters. Observers say that border closures and mobilization of security resources due to the COVID-19 global pandemic could give rise to ISIS attacks, which has already lost all of its urban strongholds in Syria and neighboring Iraq after receiving crushing defeats from government forces in both countries. Every so often, remnants of the terror group hunkered down in desert hideouts launch hit-and-run attacks against government forces and their allied fighters, as well as on civilians in both countries. However, the Syrian Army and the Popular Mobilization Forces highlighted that the group remained far weaker and was relying on disinformation to stay in the limelight. Despite what Daesh remnants are advertising, their attacks in Iraq and Syria are far less than in previous years. They are attempting to keep themselves relevant through disinformation on social media, regular media, and amplifying their messages for recruitment.
To discuss the issue of ISIS resurgence in Syria, with us from Damascus is Vanessa Bailey, freelance journalist and photographer. Thank you very much for being with us, Vanessa. I hope you're doing well. Well, in the past couple of weeks, we have seen ISIS staging resurgence strikes in both Iraq and Syria in a very weirdly organized manner here. All evidence leads us to think that this is not a coincidence whatsoever. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, if we go back to, I think it was around October, November in 2019, what we saw then when the Turkish occupation forces, which of course were the terrorist forces drafted in from Idlib to invade the northeast of Syria to form the buffer zone occupied by those terrorist proxies controlled by Turkey. We saw at that point that many of the ISIS prisons that had previously been under the control of the SDF, of course, another US proxy in the northeast, many of the ISIS members were looking at the Turkish invasion as an opportunity to escape and to get to Iraq. And so at this point, we saw that there was this kind of percolation effect where ISIS members from inside Syria were being taken into Iraq. And then basically there are documents showing that there are plans to create this kind of super ISIS and then to re-inject it back into Syria. And I think to some extent, that's what we're seeing now. And of course, the attacks, as you said, on the PMU in Iraq also.
Mm-hmm. Well, ISIS was largely decimated by local and by regional forces in recent years, but now they threaten to regroup, as you just said, by exploiting government weaknesses in areas like Al-Badiya in Homs and Al-Mayadeen in Deir, where there are deserts, by the way. But how are they able to regroup with the necessary armaments and the funding that they need to keep this fast pace between Iraq and Syria at the same time? And we're talking about vast swaths of land here.
And I think, you're absolutely right when you point out that there is what has been called recently by Anna News, the kind of ISIS triangle, which goes from Homs, Palmyra to Deir Ezzor and then down to towards Al-Tanaf. So basically what you have is, I believe, over the porous borders of Iraq, of course, weapons and machinery and equipment are coming in, but also in Al-Tanaf, which has control of a 55-kilometer circumference area, which includes a Rukban camp, which is ostensibly a refugee camp, but which we know is effectively a recruitment camp. We know from testimony of Syrian civilians who've managed to leave and to return to their homes around Palmyra and Homs, that basically this is a recruitment and rearmament center, particularly for ISIS and for the other armed groups that are under the control of the US in that area. We assume, and through my own investigations, we believe that the arms and the weapons are coming in through the Jordan border there. But so from Iraq and from Jordan, the ISIS militants are being rearmed and re-equipped. And in my opinion also, many of these proxy groups are interchangeable. In other words, for me, ISIS is just another label. It may be that other members of other militant groups that are acting as proxies of the US coalition will merge with ISIS because they are better instrumentalized, better power multiplied, better equipped and richer they will join them and fight with them. So it's like an ever-changing scenery of terrorist groups. So I think, for me, I always try to get away from the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda in this, because actually they pretty much interchange and mingle together. It's just depending on the funding streams and on the weaponization.
I want to touch about this fact in general, when Syria has been calling for so long now for the US occupation to leave Syrian soil, but at the same time we're now seeing exercises, military exercises being conducted between a new Takfiri group known as, with a new name, Maghawir al-Thawra, which proves your point that there's no point in naming them, they are all the same, near the southern 10th garrison, which you also pointed out now. And I mean, ironically here, the Pentagon has barred entry to this area for Syrian and Russian forces. We're talking about a Syrian soil here. The Pentagon has barred Syrian army forces to enter there because it's being exclusively held by US, and we know that ISIS is also there. How do you think this will play out given the recent ISIS attack inside Syrian territory that is controlled by the Syrian government?
Absolutely. I think this is part of the American plan to maintain what I would call a kind of spoiler presence inside Syria. So they will maintain the Al-Tanaf base. They will maintain the Rukban refugee camp, because that for them is a recruitment center, as I said, for these armed groups, whether it's ISIS or whatever nomenclature you want to give them. We know, for example, there are ISIS derivatives, let's call them that, back in the Deir region. We know from contacts on the ground that people in Sweden and in the villages around in the countryside of Sweden are expecting another possible ISIS attack from the Badiya, from the desert. We know that recently they've been attacking into eastern Homs. And if we go back to, I think it's the RAND paper on swarming, this new warfare where small groups of militants will attack and withdraw, and that's very much what we're seeing. In March this year, of course, we have to remember that an SAS, a British SAS soldier, was airlifted out of the southern Syrian area where he'd been injured by an IED. Now, one has to ask what an SAS Special Forces operative is doing in southern Syria, which is back under the control of the Syrian government. But obviously, this clandestine intelligence operation is continuing. ISIS is one of the tools that they're going to be using, I believe, to continue the destabilization efforts in these areas of Syria, while the main bulk of the Syrian Arab Army is focused, of course, still on Idlib and on the northwest.
Well, Vanessa, amid all this tension, we see always the main player coming back to the playground here. I'm talking about Israel, which has conducted a series of attacks against Syria with highly intensifying illegal cross-border raids as COVID-19 also rages in both regions. So they're not only taking care of that, they're also going on and taking care with their criminal behavior as well. So now it's ISIS on the ground in the east, the US on the ground in the east, we have Turkish occupation in the north, and now Israel in the skies of Syria. Does this seem like a series of unfortunate, unrelatable events to you?
Well, I mean, you know, I've always said we always, with any event, with any world event, we have to look at the timing. And if we look at the timing of the so-called COVID-19 pandemic, you know, I'm not going to argue that whether it is a pandemic or not on here, but if we look at the timing of this, both the economic pressure to be brought to bear on countries like Iran, on Venezuela, and on Syria, but there was a recent paper at the Brookings Institute, which of course is funded by Bill Gates, among other hegemons in the region. Basically, Israel is looking to exploit COVID-19 in the sense that it considers that Hezbollah and Iran and Syria are going to be distracted by dealing. They're going to be putting resources towards dealing with COVID-19. So this gives them, according to this paper, the perfect opportunity to drive a wedge between Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria. In other words, to now target the Iranian and the Hezbollah military bases, as they describe them. Of course, very often they're targeting residential areas under cover of the fact that it's an Iranian base, and it doesn't detract from the fact that anyway this is against international law. And so therefore, I think what we're seeing is an exploitation of the COVID-19 crisis. We're seeing a reoccupation of Syrian territory by US troops in the northeast, but also to the north of Aleppo. So they're basically coming back to bases that they previously departed from. So we're seeing Israel, Turkey with the attacks on the Hama region yesterday by the Turkish proxy terrorist occupation forces. We're seeing American reoccupation of Syrian territory, and we're seeing an uptick in Israeli unlawful aggression against Syria, fundamentally to try and destroy the alliance between Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria in particular. So we're seeing a definite exploitation of the crisis, which is affecting everybody in the region.
You think that will work?
In order
in
to
less than a
further
minute,
their
you think
agenda.
that will work?
No, I don't think it will work, because I think Syria and their allies are fortified, in fact, by this crisis. I mean, Syria is dealing with the crisis in a very pragmatic, in a very sensible way. We're not seeing a lot of the hysteria that we've seen in the West, or a lot of the sensationalism that we've seen in the West. And militarily, they are still continuing steadily to resist the effort to obviously destabilize Syria further. And so therefore, I think what we're seeing is an exploitation of the COVID-19 crisis, but we're seeing, again, which we've seen throughout the last 10 years, a pragmatic and effective response from the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and its allies.
I want to thank you very much, Vanessa Bili, freelance journalist and photographer, for joining us from Damascus to tell us about the latest ISIS attacks on Syrian soil. Thank you for your kind contribution, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.